This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 472, Access Policy API. On today's show, we're talking about Access Policy API, what it does, and how you can use it with Christian van de Ende. We'll also cover visitors as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Christian van de Ende, who last joined us on episode 226. So almost 250 episodes ago-ish, where he was joining us to talk about group that time around. He had been working with Drupal for around 15 years, maintains the group module and some of that ecosystem. He's also a subsystem maintainer of cache and user in core. Christian, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us. I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for her third week, Aubrey Sambor, Lead Engineer at Lullabot.
Hey, glad to be back.
And last, certainly not least, Nick Laughlin, Founder at Enlightened Development.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
And now, to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted a Drupal native solution for tracking website visitors and their behavior? There's a module for that. It's called Visitors, and it was created in March of 2009 by user Gashev, though recent releases are by Stephen Ayers, who goes by BlueGeek9 on Drupal.org. It has an 8.x-2.19 version, which works with Drupal 10 and 11, and it is actively maintained, has coverage for both security and automated tests, and it does have a documentation guide on Drupal.org as well. It has 20 open issues, none of which are bugs against the 8.x branch, which is pretty great considering that the module is officially in use by over 6,000 sites. Now, a benefit of using a Drupal native solution is that you retain full ownership over your visitor data. Not sharing that data with third parties can be important for data protection regulations as well as data privacy concerns. You also have a variety of reports you can access directly within the Drupal UI, including top pages, refers, and more. There is a submodule for GeoIP lookups using MaxMind if you also want reporting on what region, country, or city your visitors hail from. It provides drush commands to download a GeoIP database and then update your data based on GeoIP lookups using that database. It should be mentioned that the downside of using Drupal as your analytics solution is the potential performance impact and also a likely uptick in usage for hosting that charges based on the number of dynamic requests served. All that being said, let's talk more about visitors.
I just want to say, but before we talk about the module, I noticed something on the module page that he has like a little graphic that says that he'll prioritize new community members and active community member requests, which I think is interesting. I think I might add that to a couple modules I maintain. I think it encourages people to participate more actively, or if they're new, to call that out. I think this is cool. It feels like it's a replacement for the statistics module in core, maybe a little more powerful. I'm curious if you have a scale on how much of a performance hit this gives, because I imagine it's not linear with the traffic. I imagine it can very quickly, if you have a very active site, I imagine this very quickly increases the burden.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really have any hard data on that question. I know for a long time, anybody who was passionate about performance in Drupal would say, one of the first things you should do is disable the statistics module. So the fact that they're touting this as a replacement, it does make you wonder if there's been, or what's been done to sort of mitigate the potential performance impact. And I don't necessarily have any visibility on that.
I mean, it does use JavaScript, it looks like, for the actual updating, but Drupal's still the back end. So that doesn't actually help too much on the performance, I think. But yeah, I mean, this is I have a couple clients that might be interested in this because they want some data sometimes, but not like long term, and they're concerned about privacy as well. So this might be good.
And I think also with Google Analytics, there used to be some restrictions from their terms of use in terms of, the sites had to be publicly available and so on. So not necessarily a good fit for like intranets or some kind of, more private sites. And so something like this could be a solution, again, particularly for something that's maybe not super high traffic.
I wonder, I wonder how this compares or contrasts to I know that PI Wick used to be like a self-hosted sort of analytics solution. I'm wondering how this compares, because that would be obviously outside of Drupal, right? It would be on another installation on your server somewhere. So I wonder if that would be like a way to overcome the performance hit, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Piwik and Matomo, I learned recently, sort of are, diverged forks of kind of a single common, project years ago. So I think they're similar in terms of being either self-hosted or at least, kind of third-party, potentially hosted analytics apps that can be, again, another alternative to something like a Google Analytics.
Yeah.
I think you're right that they might be engineered a little bit more in terms of optimized, because being an application specifically built for handling analytics might have some additional optimizations built in from a performance standpoint, but then you would need to sort of have a Drupal integration to bring in the reporting the way that you would have with something like visitors. So that's probably where there's a potential trade-off there.
Yeah, I do find it nice that this kind of sits right inside your Drupal, your Drupal instance, and you can access those analytics right from there. So it takes away that extra login, definitely. I also wonder, and maybe you do or don't know this, but the GeoIP database, how much cruft does that add?
So it's kind of a CSV file. I haven't downloaded one in a while, but if I recall correctly, it's not really a huge database. It's just sort of IP ranges and then kind of the city that they map to. So it's not a ton of data. It's nice that it does sort of download that locally, and then that way it can sort of run against a local data file as opposed to sort of running a whole bunch of queries against some kind of a third-party API.
Yeah, definitely. Huh. Interesting. Wow. I find this to be very interesting, and now you've got my wheels turning yet again, Martin, on whether I really need Google Analytics or not. I don't know. I'll update you in the future if I decide to switch. As always, thank you, Martin, for an enlightening module of the week. If folks wanted to get a hold of you, suggest a module, or just chat, how could they go about doing that?
We are always glad to get nominations for Module of the Week or discuss any past ones in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot, Martin.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone.
Join us for the Open Source Camp, which includes Drupal Camp Chattanooga, happening in person November the 2nd at Chattanooga State Community College. Besides sessions on open source technologies, this year we will also have 2-day-long introductory trainings for WordPress and Drupal, WordPress in a day and Drupal in a day, an opportunity to learn what these technologies provide out of the box and which one might suit your needs best.
Attendees and speakers have worked for your local government, federal, and higher ed institutions. Register at opensource.camp. Limited spots available. See you then.
All right, let's move on to our primary topic. All right, so we're talking about Access Policy API today, and I can honestly say that I know very little about it. So can we start by like what is the elevator pitch for the access policy API?
Yeah, sure. So essentially what we used to have in Drupal was two ways to hand out permissions. You would either be user one and you would have access to everything, or you would have certain user roles assigned to your accounts, and those user roles would come with permissions, right? That was inherently very limited in what you can do with it. You had the UI where you would assign permissions and you would assign those roles, and it wasn't very dynamic, so to speak. But there are use cases where sometimes, based on a contextually available value, so the time of day, what region of the world you're in, things that we can deduce from the global context. So based on some of those values, you would want people to have access or not. And that could be, for instance, an example that I often give is that there are some countries where you have the right to disconnect, such as Australia, for instance. So you could enforce that by disallowing people to do anything on a website outside of office hours. Now, how do you get that done in Drupal? You would have to run a script that would each night take away those roles from people and then assign them again. Or if you like security issues, you could try to dynamically edit those roles and your site would crash and burn for reasons that I'm not going to get into. Now, with the access policy API, all of this is easy and like extremely easy. So now we've taken what was already in core, the user one and the role situation, and we've turned those into policies. But you can add any amount of policies to those too, and they will work. So you could write a policy that basically says, outside of office hours, we revoke all of your permissions. Or you could write a policy that says, unless your account has two-factor authentication added, you do not get any destructive permissions assigned, such as deleting content, right? So you can do you can go as crazy as you want, basically, with these. And the cool thing about them is that they're actually quite performant. So it gets cached, and it works really well across multiple types of personas you can have on a website. It works really well.
So, how my question then is, do you have visibility into any of these policies? Like, let's take the example you mentioned from Australia. You want to add a policy that says, these permissions can't be applied during these hours. Do you have to like look at the code to see that, or is there some way to see what policies a particular site has?
So there's two layers to that question. First of all, if you look at any individual access policy, it's basically up to you. If it's on a client project and everyone knows about the requirements, then you could have that in code and just let it sit in code. If you have a module on Drupal.org, for instance, for this office hours scenario, then what you could do is you could allow the site builders to configure that. And then your UI would be a way to figure out what's going on with that access policy. The second part of your question is there a way to see which access policies are active? Right now, there isn't, but it's really easy to write a very tiny module that tells you. Because all access policies are tagged services. So they're already being collected by a service collector. So all you would have to do is write a very tiny module that calls that service collector, asks about all the available policies, and then lists them in like a table or something.
Okay. And I suspect that the answer to this question has something to do with the group module, but what made you think that Drupal needed the access policy API? Like, what inspired you to start writing this? And if I remember correctly, the final steps had something to do with DrupalCon Pittsburgh. But what started the journey? How did you get involved with this?
What got me down this path? Group has historically always ran into the boundaries of what you can do with core, right? It's an access module, but tries to nest itself so deep into what core does out of the box that I found that even though core should be open for modification, it wasn't always the case, right? And over time, I've had to develop systems outside of core that found its way into core. So for instance, we used to have the render cache, and it was doing this voodoo called cache redirects. I'm not going to go into technical detail here, but many other systems needed that. And what they ended up doing was putting whatever object that they wanted to cache with variations using cache redirects, they put that inside a render array and pulled that through the renderer. Now, I needed the same functionality in group, and I was like, hell no, I'm not going to do that, because that's really dirty. So I looked at the code inside, and I saw that there was an issue on Drupal.org that talked about abstracting all of this logic from within the render cache to a system of its own. So that's how variation cache was born, and I built that, and eventually that made its way into core once it was mature enough. But then we had this other system where I tried to alter your permissions dynamically, the thing that access policy is about, and I noticed that I was creating security issues because of how Drupal core works. So I needed to figure out a different way to alter your permissions dynamically. And I thought, what better use case to create this within the world of group first? Because group has a similar concept where we have these access policies that define which groups you should have access to, which groups you should see the content of. So I developed it there. And that wasn't with the scenario in the back of my head that someday this would get into core. Because getting stuff this big into core is a whole endeavor. But then as it grew more and more and more, and I started working on the newer versions of group, like version 2 and version 3, they're like sort of twin versions for a very technical reason that I now regret, this deciding on. But essentially, for group 2 and version 3, I started talking to a coworker who was interested in getting more involved in contributing. And I said, this would be a really interesting thing to put in a standalone module, because what we have right now in group 1 is basically not group specific. This could work for anything. And for instance, the domain module could benefit from this. So how about we separate this out? And the beauty of separating these pieces of code out is that the bug reports that have to go on Drupal.org for these like dedicated, smaller in footprint standalone modules, they are usually of high value and few in number. So what happened was, for instance, with variation cache, that lived in contrib for a couple of years with 0 bug reports. And the same went in flexible permissions, which is the precursor to access policy API, same story. So it leaves me sleeping better to know that like the crucial parts of my module are separated out, and that when people have issues with group, it's really group that they're having issues with, not the systems that power group, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that became standalone module. And then over time, there was this call for submissions to Pittsburgh. And I was talking to that same coworker, and I was like, actually, this could work really well for core. Because what I found over the years is that whenever I build something really cool in group, my feeling is like, I wish we had this in core. I've had it with variation cache, I've had it with the access policy API, and I've also had it with this handler system that I have in group, which is far superior to what we have for entity types in core. So that I still need to get into core somehow, but I feel like I've done enough for now.
So
yeah.
I have two quick clarification questions. What was the contributed module that you created for permissions before it got moved into core?
Flexible permissions. So flexible _ permissions. And that was after a long back and forth with that coworker of mine on a name. Naming things is hard. And we ended on flexible permissions because basically that's what they are.
So there's another contrib module called access policy, which seems to do something similar. It was developed by Pega, I think. I imagine that's unrelated to the core access policy stuff that we're talking about today, and it's unrelated to flexible permissions.
Yeah, completely. I've looked at some of these modules that were out there, and they're like completely different.
Okay.
Access Policy API is actually a whole system on its own that you build on top of. And these modules were the ones that I saw were mainly trying to solve the use case, but like as a one-to-one relationship. Like we have this problem space and I want to solve it. So this is my solution to that problem space. And it wasn't thinking outside of the box, like most of them weren't, in the sense that, you know, I don't know the problem space, but I want to build a system that can be applied to all of them, as long as it's, you know, about handing out permissions based on certain conditions.
Sounds good.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier on, but how did Drupal handle access before this API? Like, can you go more in detail about that? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So you'll often find that either in custom code or contrib code, there is this thing, this method being called has permission. So you would call that on a user, you would call that on the current user, you would have this access result and then allowed if has permission. But essentially what it boiled down to was we were always going back to some form of user object, and we were checking whether that user object's ID was 1, or whether if we loaded their roles, the permission that you were looking for was inside of one of the roles permission sets. That's all we did. And then in the cache context for the user permissions, we would load all of your roles, grab basically a big bag of all of your permissions and pull that through a hash. So that we would have this string that represented your roles. And then if someone else came along with the same hash, then they would get the same cache entry. That's what we had. And the reason that was limited, and also a security issue, if you wanted to change those roles, is that cache context can fold. So if you have the user cache context and you have the user.permissions cache context, if both of those are present on the same cacheable object, and the object can be cached, because sometimes we ignore the user cache context, what happens is they fold into each other. And the cacheable metadata that we gave along with the user permissions cache context so that we can still invalidate the entry if something changed were your roles. So now let's assume you're on a page where both of them are present and it got folded. If I start dynamically changing your roles, that page will never get invalidated because I'm not saving your roles. I don't want those roles to be saved. I want it like during the lifetime of the current request, I wanted to remove or add some permissions to or from those roles, right? But that would lead to cache and you getting like the wrong results and everything. So that was a security issue. Well, it wasn't a security issue. It would become a security issue as soon as you try to hand out dynamic permissions. So now what happens is with the Access Policy API, without going into too much detail on how it actually works, is we have all of these policies, and upfront, they tell you what their logic varies by. So they specify a cache context that represents their logic. We go over all of these policies to gather or revoke permissions. And at the end, we're going to gather all of these cache contexts that were declared, and we're going to put your calculated permissions into the variation cache. And so that someone with the same global circumstances as you, so same time of day or same region of the world or what have you, would get the same set of cached permissions. So that's why it's so performant, right? Now, when we grab all of this, we still need to take care of the user permissions cache context. So what do we do with that now? Well, this is really cool because the cached set of permissions inside a variation cache lives like in complete isolation. None of the cacheable metadata from there needs to necessarily make it up to the page because it's fully isolatable. It's a separate system. So what we do now is in the cache context for the user permissions, we ask for all of your calculated permissions and we hash those again like we used to do. So that remains the same. But then we ask for all of the cacheable dependencies that were used during the calculating of your permissions, and we add those to whatever is cached if the user permissions cache context were to be folded away. Now, what's the key difference here? Because this may sound a little complicated explaining all of this.
Yeah.
The difference is, out of the box, Drupal still has two access policies. One is if you're user 1, right? That can never change. So we don't even have a user dependency there. Your ID of your user account will never change, right? No dependencies there. And then we have the user roles access policy, which does what we used to do, grabs the permissions from your user roles. And then it says every user role is a cacheable dependency. Because if we update that role, some of the permissions may have vanished or be added or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just have those two, and then in the user permissions cache context, we ask for your calculated permissions, which goes over all of these access policies, we would get what we used to have. We would get the cache tags of the user roles assigned to your account, just like we used to have. So there, nothing changes. The difference is if you now add a third policy, which has some cacheable dependencies, those will also make it into the cacheable dependencies being returned by that cache context, so that when the user permissions cache context gets folded away, all of the necessary tags are there. Meaning that you can now dynamically alter someone's permissions, and it will not lead to these security issues where we're serving the wrong cache entry.
Interesting. But with access policy, you shouldn't need to dynamically change permissions as much anymore, right? You can just write an access policy to calculate that the dynamic portion, right? If I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, so that's what they do. So you don't need to worry about any of that. And a key change that we have is instead of going into one of these user objects and calling has permission on them, we now have this central service called a permission checker. So the user object now basically relays any has permission call to that central permission checker, which also has a has permission method. But that one calls the access policy processor, which loops over all of the access policies to get your complete set of permissions. And then it checks whether you have that permission inside of that complete set. So it basically moved those checks from like 3 or 4 places in core into a single centralized service. And that's how that works. So it used to be that if you wanted to, for instance, say you can only access the site during office hours, you would have to go into every single access check on the website, whether it was on a route, on a view, in custom code, wherever, and you would have to hook into those if you even could, because not everything is as easy to hook into. And there you would have to do a check for the time of day, which was insane. And every time you downloaded and enabled a new module, same problem all over again.
Yep.
Now you can basically replace those permission checks. So you can basically say, I don't want people to be able to create nodes outside of office hours. So you just don't give them that permission. And because everything in those modules in core checks for that permission, if it's missing, you don't have it. So you don't have access.
So this might be a dumb question, but when you're defining a new access policy like these time things, do you also have to define, like, how do you define the granularity, right? How does it know, like, hey, you're not allowed to edit this after 6 p.m. It's now 6:01. Change, like, does cron have to run? Do you basically tell it the specific time, like it has the expire date of 6 p.m. because that's when it handles it, and then the normal caching system will expire because it's after the expire date, or how does that piece work?
So that is by virtue of cache context. So every access policy has to be, has to is a big word, but almost every cache context has to be accompanied by a corresponding, every access policy has to be accompanied by a corresponding cache context. So if you have the access policy that says during office hours you can do X and outside of office hours you can't, then there would have to be a cache context that tells you whether or not it's during office hours. It's a Boolean cache context. It's just 0 or 1, right? And inside that cache context, you would then look up whatever configuration UI you had to put in these values, what is defined as office hours, and just compare them to the current time, which is a global contextual value that we can look into. And then you basically return 0 or 1. So what happens is when we cache your permissions in the variation cache, there is one version of your permissions during office hours, and there is one version of your permissions outside of office hours. And every day, as you go over that threshold, we just return the different cache entry.
Yeah, that makes so much more sense. So this does proliferate the number of cache entries you have, but it's performant because they're very granular single lookups,
Yeah,
right?
and by definition, cache contexts need to be fast. If you have a cache context that needs to load 50 entities to determine its value, you're doing something wrong. So they need to be fast. So it is. But the cool thing is, because we are using the variation cache, we can use cache redirects, which is an optimization layer of its own. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that we can share permissions between people. As I mentioned before, if two people show up outside of office hours, then they would get the same results if they have the other global variables matching up. Like, so it's very simple to still make it performant, because on most configured websites you will still have a large audience that gets the same entry from cache.
Can you
Yeah.
so based on that premise, right? Of like, hey, and we'll use the same like, hey, office hours type of policy, right? Do you have the ability to assign a role based on a policy? So for example, I don't know, user one logs in outside of office hours. Is there some sort of user role that they could be given that's like, I don't know, less permission to do things like, hey, you're outside of office hours, you can only do like these three things, as opposed to if you were to log in during office hours, you could do X number of things. Like, can you change roles based on access policy?
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. So that could work in multiple ways. So you could so I wouldn't advocate for roles necessarily, but you could. So what you could do is you could go into your UI where you configure your roles and their permissions, and you could create a couple of roles that say, in their label, access policy only or something, so that it's clear that you shouldn't be assigning them.
Right.
Or you could hook into the user edit form so that they don't show up, or you could create an entity reference selection plugin, or there are numerous ways to make sure that they wouldn't be assignable. Yeah. And then you would only assign them through an access policy. That's perfectly fine. If you look at the user roles access policy, you can see how we do that for the ones that are assigned to your account. You could create a sort of twin access policy that does the same thing for those that aren't. Did I say aren't before? I think I did. Whatever. So the one in core does it for the ones that are assigned to your account, and you could create one for the ones that aren't assigned to your account based on whatever condition you want. Group does something really similar to what you just said. So group has it's a very complex use case. It has 3 scopes, different identifiers, but based on your global values, we load up certain group roles and just assign them to you. And those roles are configurable in the UI.
Yes,
So
that's one thing I remember about group. The number of checkboxes compared to a standard Drupal installation, there were significantly more checkboxes, but it's nice to know that that's all packaged behind the new access policy system.
so we've kind of been covering a lot of the like dev specific stuff with the access policy API, and obviously it's an API, so obviously it's very kind of like dev heavy, right? I'm wondering, well, two questions. One is, are there modules that exist that interact with the access policy API?
Yeah, a coworker of mine has just released a module. I think it's called external roles. So we had a client recently where they were, well, I'm actually working on a project right now in absence of my coworker because he's gone on vacation for 2 months, and obviously someone has to pick up where he left off. So that person was me. But he wrote a little module that he contributed, which can look into any external system and get some criteria from that system that you map to roles. So essentially external roles, it could be Active Directory. In our case, it was something called Contacts API, I believe. And that maps it to a YAML file inside your custom code that says, okay, if they have that external role, they need to get these Drupal permissions. If they have that external role, they need to get those Drupal permissions. Pulls that through an access policy, and that's how that works. And then on that same project, we just created a bunch of new access policies. So this is a really cool project in that matter, because it would have been a nightmare to develop before Access Policy API, and it's actually a breeze right now. So we have 2 more systems, like they combine 3 APIs to determine the access of a persona. And one is being solved with those external roles. One is being solved with something called rights. And then another is being solved with custom logic that determines which persona you are based on your email address, etc. And all of that we have written access policies for. And the cool thing is, it just works. So we have 0 hook form alters or whatever to alter any module's form. We have 0 route alters. We have like none of that. It
Wow.
just works. Yeah.
So I want to be very explicit here because I was confused by this when I was writing the show notes for this show, right? You have the Access Policy API, and then you have the Access Policy module. The Access Policy module has nothing to do with the Access Policy API, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And I think on the Access Policy module page, they actually highlight like what the key differences are. So
Today, I haven't looked since.
yeah, I just looked because I was like, wait a second. Based on Nick's previous question, I was like, hold on, these two things aren't what I thought they were. But my follow-up question is like, if I'm a non-developer, if I'm not somebody who's going to write a YAML file, if I'm not somebody that's necessarily going to jump into code, is there a way for me to create access policies using the UI? Like, could I use like ECA or something like that to create an access policy?
No, it's really, it's also too important to allow it to be generated by a module, because of the necessary ingredients. It would be hard to generate this. You basically need AI to figure out what you want to do and then convert that into code. And right now, I don't trust AI with backend code just yet. So essentially, every access policy needs to somehow figure out what a global value, like time of day, etc., as I mentioned before, and, and translate that into permissions or the revoking thereof. And then it needs to have a cache context that can tell you those values of that global value so that we can cache it. And then it needs to be declared to the access policy processor with perhaps a given weight if you want them to run later or earlier than some other access policies. Having that generated sounds like a pipe dream. But what I do envision, so for the site builders out there, what I do see happening in the near future is a new suite of modules popping up.
Yeah.
I've given these examples. You need to have 2-factor authentication. You need to have, you need to be within office hours, etc. All of these use cases could be dedicated modules with a proper test suite, with a nice UI, with all the bells and whistles that you would expect of a good site builder module, and that would just work for you. And the beauty of this is that they would 90% of the time or even more would work well together. And that's where access modules used to go completely, I was going to say something else, haywire. If you try to combine them. Access modules never played well together. Access policy API modules play extremely well together because the system is designed for every access policy to live in isolation. They should be ignorant of any other access policy.
I think one of the coolest things that's come out of this, because I've been following along a little bit on the outskirts, is that it's causing the community at large to kind of question some basic assumptions. For example, the big change in core, other than getting the API, and the big change in core was user one, right? I've never thought of user one as like, yes, it's a special unicorn, and a lot of clients we block the user one because I never really thought beyond that. But honestly, user one is a security issue, right? If somebody compromises user one, it's a much bigger deal than if any other account gets compromised. Well, with access policy, we now have the super user policy, and we're slowly they've been removing kind of the specialness of user one and putting it in that policy, which also means that if user one does get compromised, you can just apply that policy to a different user and recover the site. So it's making Drupal more resilient in that manner. And the second really big, like, core ripple effect that I've been seeing is a lot of tests in core relied on the test user being user one and being, so the tests weren't exactly covering everything that they needed to be covering because it was user one. He was a super, the test user was a super user and could kind of do whatever they wanted. Once that policy came in place, you had to actually be much more intentional about what permissions and policies were applying in a test and make sure that it was actually covering, there wasn't some permission being applied that allowed the test user to do something it otherwise wouldn't be allowed to. So the quality of core tests have been going up as that policy has been removed from certain places.
Yeah, exactly. There is one clarification that I need to make. It's that you wouldn't be able to assign the user access policy to a different user necessarily. What you can do instead, and this is already in core, is you can just turn off that access policy altogether so that your website is secure. And if someone compromises user one, they're nothing special. Like if you assigned user one an admin role or something, then they're still an admin. But out of the box, they're not like this sort of god emperor that can do anything. You can just turn that policy off. And then if you somehow lock yourself out of your website by mistakenly revoking the admin role from the last admin, then you could turn that policy on again and make someone an admin by logging in as user one and then making whoever you want an admin again. You can turn off user one by a simple setting in your settings file. It's in your services.yaml file. So we've put that behind the flag. And that's what happened. That's exactly what's happening in those tests that you described. All tests now run with that flag off.
Yep. Oh, so you finished converting all those tests? Because I know there's a long list of tests to get through.
Let me check. Most of them are done. Yeah. So we split that off. And I think we had a large amount, and I think we're down to 3 or something. Yeah, so 2 are yellow, 1 is red, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Over 20 subsystems or modules in core have been fixed.
Wow.
So now the only ones
it's impressive.
are content moderation, forum, and media. Those are the only ones that still rely on user one in their tests.
Wow. Wow, that's impressive. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. There's a couple. We've been talking about access policy, and I think there's a couple things in there. There's a policy-based access control and an attribute-based access control. What's the difference between those two approaches?
Right. So attribute-based access control, we still have that, by the way. But what basically happens with that is you look at any given object, and based on some of its attributes, such as the status flag on a node, whether it's published or not, you determine access to it, right? Now in Drupal, we've almost never had pure attribute-based access control. We would almost never say, oh, this has, the color green assigned to it, so you don't have access. We would always accompany that with a permission check, almost always, right? And then, so user one was the same thing. User one was the only pure attribute-based access check that I can think of, because we would really just say, oh, the globally available user account has this attribute, you have access. That's the only one that I can think of. Other than that, we had role-based access, which is RBAC. But again, that wasn't pure, because in role-based access, you would assign someone a role, and based on which roles they had, you would give them access. In Drupal, it's more complicated. It would be based on the permissions attached to their roles, you would have access. The difference with policy-based access is that you can have any sort of deterministic system that tells you which policy is applied to someone, and those translate into permissions. So secretly, our role-based access control was actually policy-based access control, but it was hidden under this layer of role-based access control. And that's what I did when I created the access policy API. I basically made that pure. So I took what we had in our role-based access control and I converted that into more pure policy-based access control.
So this brought up another question for me then. Does access policies kind of replace the need for node grants? Then?
No, it can, but it doesn't yet. And I can circle this back to group. Group is, by my knowledge, the only access module out there, and people can mail in and correct me if I'm wrong, but by my knowledge, group is the only module out there that correctly leverages query access for all possible entity types, right? The reason we still have node grants is because we don't have this generic system yet where we can inform Drupal about things that need to apply to queries so that they become safe and that we don't show, for instance, taxonomy terms that shouldn't be shown because people don't have access, right? So, and the way group does that is by looking into its calculated permissions coming from its own access policies and then adding extra conditions to the query. So what I end up doing, for instance, is if there are nodes and they might be grouped. So first I check, is this grouped or not? I do that with a join. And then I continue, okay, they're grouped and we have plugins that allow you to put these nodes in groups. So let's look at the permissions defined by those plugins and whether or not you have them. Oh, you have the permission to view your own nodes in this group. Okay, so let's add a condition to the query that says, does the node belong to you? And then I go over the permissions that could apply, and we alter the query as we go. So the query might become a little bit more complex, but we can assure you that when you see a list of nodes anywhere on your website, you will never see nodes that you shouldn't be seeing because they were somehow in a group that you don't have access to, right? Core doesn't have this. So as soon as we built this generic query access layer, Core immediately has this because the access policy has all the permission check stuff covered. We just need to translate that into query alterations. But that layer doesn't exist yet. There is a notion of it in the Entity API module. So not Entity API in Core, but the module that I helped develop a couple of years ago. It was mainly Bojan Jivanovic, who used to work with Commerce. He wrote the code, but it was a discussion that he and I were having at a DrupalCon. I don't know which one. I think it was Vienna. And yeah, essentially, we landed on this, and I first implemented it in group, but then it turned out that group was too complex for such a generic solution. So sadly, I had to take it out again and write my own. But the solution that I've written is very similar to the one in Entity API. It's just a bit more complex.
Okay.
Yeah, can you actually go a little bit more into how the access policy API works with all these different access controls, the policy attribute one and the role one? I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Okay, so roles is very simple. Roles have been fully converted into a policy, right? So that's no longer role-based access control, that is policy-based access control. Attribute still needs to exist. We still need to be able to give someone access to a node when it's published, but deny them access when it's unpublished. So there will always be that attribute check involved. So access policies don't care about those at all. They care about the other part of that equation. So if you want to grant someone access to a node, you have a permission check and you have an attribute check. The permission check is where access policy API comes in. So what you can perfectly control whether or not someone has access to unpublished nodes, for instance, by writing an access policy that grants them the view any unpublished nodes permission during specific office hours or whatever, and that is how you can still control that. You don't need to control those attributes because that would again lead to a situation where you would have to hook into millions of places to quickly alter the node status. And that's not what we want. We want it to be easy and we want it to be performant. So attribute checks remain existing. So people have come up to me at DrupalCon Barcelona like a month ago because I had a session there about the access policy API. And during the questions, they asked a couple of questions, and one of them boiled down to what you can do to individual nodes then from within an access policy. And the answer was, well, if it's not globally available, well, nothing. If it's any node, there's nothing we can do. However, if you can make that node that you're interested in globally available, then there's everything we can do. So for instance, the front page is a specific special node. If you have a node as a front page, because that we can deduce from the global context. We even have a cache context in core for that. URL.path is front or something, or is front page or whatever it's called. We have a cache context for that, so you wouldn't even need to write that. Group has something similar with group sites. With group sites, which allows you to turn a site that was built with group into like a multi-site. We have this sort of context provider system, which allows you to, from the global context values, determine which group, ergo microsite, is active. So now we can write access policies that apply only to your active microsite because it's something that we can grab from the global context.
Interesting.
So I wanna go back to the like kind of like creating access policies question, right? And we already established that like there's no kind of like UI or like there are modules being created, but there's no like UI for creating access policies, right? I'm wondering, and in my head, I'm thinking maybe the answer here is like a straight no, because there seems to be code needed for access policies, like to implement an access policy. But I'm wondering, like, is there a future where an access policy could be created via a recipe?
I wouldn't necessarily say via a recipe, because a recipe is generally a combination of modules and how they're configured, and that is shipped as one package. So if you wanted to add an access policy in there, that would still be some code as part of that recipe.
Right.
What I do envision possible is you used to have the rules module, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's not called ECA, or what is it? Or is that something else?
Yeah, ECA. I mean, ECA is similar. It's like it's like I don't know. I would dare to call it Rules 2.0, if you will.
Okay. So what you could do is you could create a submodule or like a standalone module for ECA in this example, which allows you to evaluate a global context value, and based on that, trigger the action that grants or revokes permissions, right? And then that module could translate that into an actual access policy, right? That could, in a distant future, or perhaps a not so distant future, could be possible. I would be careful with that. It would work. And for your smaller websites, because you're like a site builder and you're not working on an enterprise website and you do need this access policy behavior, that would work. However, it would definitely not be as performant as a customly written access policy. And it might even come with some bugs or security issues if that module that allows you to build these access policies hasn't got all bases covered. So theoretically, it would be possible to have a UI to build your own access policies, sure, but I would only recommend it if you have no other option, like if you have no other choice.
Okay.
So I'm curious about the future of the access policy API. So specifically, I know the access policy got in 10.3, right? So that was
Yeah,
4
10.3
months
and
ago.
11.
Yeah, so three months ago or so. So people are just beginning to start to implement it. It, as we already talked about, it uncovered a lot. I don't want to say bugs, but it uncovered a lot of places for improvement in core. And I've seen a lot of work on your side, the contribute channel, like fixing. Most of the stuff I've been seeing has been fixes around cache, to be honest. And it's funny, until we started this discussion, I never really made the connection of why cache and access is so closely tied, but it's really obvious now that we're talking about this, why they're so closely tied together. What do you see as the future of the access policy kind of initiative? Are you kind of in a cleanup phase? Are you looking at adding the attribute stuff? What's the future look like?
Well, I would imagine that the future holds a couple of these modules that I gave examples of, so that people who want the same use cases like office hours and all of that stuff, that they would just be able to download a module and use that. That would be something that I envision in the near future. There's definitely a lot of room there for new popular modules. As I said before, it's a whole new ecosystem and it's ripe for the taking. So if you ever dream of creating this module that is used by thousands of websites, now's your chance. So that's to get people motivated. That's one thing. But just like the variation cache, I consider Access Policy API sort of like finished, in a sense that I've used it for so many years within Group, and I've almost never had to make changes to it because it's abstracted out of a system that uses it, and it just works. We recently did uncover a potential bug in the variation cache as it was underneath the Access Policy API. So for the first time in years, we've added like 10 extra lines of code there, which do some hardening. And now in Drupal 10.4 or 3 even, I think, and 11, we have this check whether or not you're using your cache context correctly, and if not, there will be something logged in the server logs telling you your site is potentially insecure. Starting from Drupal 12, and I still don't see this going really well, we're actually planning on throwing an exception so that your site could go down if it's insecure.
Yeah,
We're going to
that,
have a lot of pushback on that one.
that's good. That's gonna be like when they stopped allowing what was it like? You used to just have random permissions, be able to have random permissions in your role files, even if that permission no longer existed. And then after Drupal 10, they were like, nope, you can't have invalid permissions in your role file.
Yes,
And
exactly.
that caused a lot of, but it's better to move forward. I mean, yeah, it's painful, but it's a one-time thing. And usually it's pretty straightforward to update these types of things.
Yeah, I mean those two things feel different to me. Like it's one thing if you have a permission in a file somewhere that doesn't actually exist, and like your site being insecure or throwing an exception. Like those feel different to me, right? Like one is a potential error. Like people have insecure sites all the time. Like I don't know that an exception should be thrown to your site should maybe stop
I mean,
working or work differently.
do you think your site should stop working if you have a permission in a role file that doesn't exist? Well, like you can't import anything; it completely blows up.
Well, right,
So
but that's what should happen. Like you have a permission in a role file that doesn't exist. Like there's a mismatch there, right? But like a security issue is not shouldn't necessarily be a breaking change. I mean, yes, your site should always be secure, but like, meh, I don't know. Those things feel definitely different to me.
What we're trying to do on that front, and I've been busy the last couple of weeks, spending my contrib time that I get from Factorial on getting a new group release out the door. But one of the things high on my list that was brought to my attention at DrupalCon is there's this issue on Drupal.org, which allows us to flag any Drupal site as in development or in production. It doesn't have any other like names. It's not like staging, QA, whatever. It's just production.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that needs to be developed, but I'm willing to take that on as soon as I have some bandwidth for it. And the goal is to have that error that we're currently logging converted into an exception already if you're in development mode. So that would mean that if you're working on a client website, it could go down on dev, but not on prod. On prod, even though the site might be insecure, you would still only get those log entries. But on dev, it would go down to actually make it in your face that the site is insecure. And then as Drupal 12 gets tagged, we can see how much pushback we've had already, and then still make that decision whether or not we want to convert it into an exception all the time. But it's tricky because if it has to do with caching, it could mean that someone visits your website Saturday night at 9 p.m. when no one's working, and it so happens to trigger that scenario where your site becomes insecure, and they would face an exception in the site going down, and there would be no one on call to fix that site. So that's where the nightmare scenario comes in. But we're still on track on converting exceptions. So,
man, I struggle with any issue on Drupal.org that suggests that if there is a security problem, the site should just be like inaccessible. But
well, find the issue and comment then, because that'll be valuable.
well, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm just like kind of like marketers everywhere are like cringing at the idea of that. I can feel them. I feel their pain.
That's true.
I can already tell you how this is going to play out because I've had it a couple of times in my recent past. No one's going to notice it because it's in some issue in the issue queue. Then it's going to get committed. It's going to fly under the radar for about a day or two. And people's websites are going to blow up. And we're going to see millions of issues in the issue queue saying, hey, my website just blew up and I don't know what's happening. And then everyone's going to be mad at us and we're going to have to fix it. And it's just going to be one big mess. And in the end, we will be better for it. But I'm not looking forward to that period where we actually make that change because I know everyone will be pissed off at me.
But before we move on, you mentioned that you consider the Access API policy is complete, right? You used it for a long time in groups before you started the kind of core journey. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like? You know, what was Pittsburgh like? How did, from when you decided that this is something that core could really benefit from to when it actually got committed to 10.3? How long did that take? What was involved for people that might be considering pushing their own initiative forward?
Okay. Well, first of all, it got funded. That's a big thing to mention. The fact that it got funded means that Factorial can free up my resources and allow me to work on this like undisturbed for a few weeks on end. Yeah, and that's big because usually what my contrib time looks like is 1 day a week. We're talking about bumping it up to 2 days a week, but then I still have project work in between and you kind of lose focus. Yeah, that's a big. Secondly, we got really lucky because there were like 7, I think, 7 things, 7 applications were selected, and then the audience could vote, and only 5 got funding. And then someone from WordPress came in, or ex-WordPress, or whatever they were, came in and said, oh, hey, this Gutenberg thingy looks really cool. I'm a funded. And that freed up some extra resources, and that went to me. So I was the first loser, but through like cosmic coincidence, I ended up as the last winner, so to speak. Yeah. So we got that funding. And then my goal was we got that like in March or April or something. And as you may know, DrupalCon Europe is usually September, October. So Dev Days was coming up, and my first goal was to, at Dev Days, convince the core maintainers of my vision and whether or not they would agree to the way I envisioned implementing it. That gave me then a month or 2, 3 to actually write a proof of concepts to show to them at DrupalCon Europe. Right? So that's the cool thing. Dev Days is usually in June, DrupalCon Europe, September, October. So that's how I did it. The cool thing was that, and this was part of my pitch, it already existed. It already worked. We just needed to clean it up so that it fits into core. We need to make it a bit more abstract. But I had already prepared a demo for the core maintainers to show them how really well this works. I used group sites to demo the concept to them. I said, this is a really complex group site. I click one button and now we're on just a microsite, and look at how fast everything is, because everything else, all the other noise from the other microsites got filtered out. And that blew their minds. They were like, okay, this is really cool. So then we basically landed on a version that was acceptable. And then it sat there in the issue queue for a couple of months for various things, because we uncovered bugs in core. We uncovered tests that weren't testing correctly. Then we got performance, not complaints, but like reservations, mainly Nats, like not Catch.
Yeah.
He said, how well will this perform? And what ended up happening was I went on these side quests where Nat was working on this performance tests in core, and it needed to have a lot more metrics. So I just jumped on board with him, and we completely expanded this whole test thing that we have, this test trait in core, to work with like OpenTelemetry and then Grafana to visualize it and all that. And like a month or 2 later, we completely improved that, fixed more bugs that we found in core because of it. And then we got back onto the access policy API because we figured, now we can actually prove that it's performant. So the timeline would be, if I recall correctly, like end of the year, we added the API itself, but not the implementation. So we didn't convert core into the new access policy API. Then we started working on all of that performance stuff. And then we converted the access policy, the stuff in core into access policies.
Yeah.
Fixing all the tests along the way. And then we disabled user one, which was like a huge win because that was open for like 15 years. So we did all of that in, let's say, 5 months since DrupalCon, 6 months. Yeah, but most of the work had already been done. So the budget that was used went into actual development, and then all of the side quests came out of my contract time because it was finished, and I had basically completed my end of the contract, but it wasn't in core yet. But we specifically drew up the contract in a way saying, you know, it needs to be finished, but we cannot predict whether or not core committers will actually accept it in this current stage. And so I used my contract time as a sort of like gesture to get it into core, and that was all that performance stuff. And then it got into, and we had a big party. So. Oh, and I became a core maintainer because of that. So I told them, you know, this looks very scary, maybe to all of you, because you'll end up having to maintain this. So what if I'm the one who ends up having to maintain this? So I submitted an application for the cache subsystem saying, you know, I'm fine with being the maintainer of this. And for the user system, also, because the cache system was mainly for variation cache, which powers Access Policy API. And then the user system was Access Policy API itself. And they accepted it. So now I'm a subsystem maintainer for those two systems in core. And any issues regarding Access Policy API or variation cache will end up on my plate.
Nice. Cool. So if someone's listening to this podcast and really wants to know how to help you out and how to get involved, how do people get involved with this API?
So if you want to help me out, you can contact me on Drupal Slack. It's one of the only places that I sort of keep control over. My inbox has exploded. I don't really use Twitter anymore, or X, or whatever they want to call it nowadays. I'm still on there, but I only use it like once a year to notify people of a new group release. So Drupal Slack would be the best way to grab hold of me. However, what I've noticed is that people take the opportunity to DM me with questions, and then that information sort of like gets lost between us. There's no benefit to anyone else out there. So what I would prefer is that you create an issue on Drupal.org, and if it's a bug report, with clear steps to reproduce, and then ping me in the contribute channel. That way, other people can see it, visit that issue, star it, and perhaps help contribute to it. Because I only have so much bandwidth, but usually when people see these interesting issues being, you know, pinged in the contributes channel, they want to, you know, at least follow it and then have their say. There's like a couple of usual suspects that show up on these caching issues that I'm working on, and I really appreciate them because it seems to tickle their fancy, so to speak. They seem to be really involved with the caching subsystem, and I really appreciate these people. So yeah, shout out to them. They'll know who they are.
That's awesome. So, Christian, thank you for joining us. It's been great chatting about the Access Policy API, and we'll hope to have you back in less than 250 episodes for the next update.
Sure, it's been my pleasure, but it really depends on what I cook up next because the things that I tend to build take years. So it could very well be another 250 episodes.
Fair enough.
Yeah, last time you were on it was 5 years ago, so it's been a while. For our listeners, do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack channel in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
You can get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Christian, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, talk about Access Policy API, how best could they do that?
Yeah, we just covered that question when you weren't in there for me, but essentially what I said was Drupal Slack. DM me if it's like something really personal or short, but preferably if it's something the broader community can also benefit from or contribute to, create an issue on Drupal.org, and then ping me in the contribute channel on Drupal Slack, linking to that issue.
Perfect. Aubrey, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me mainly on Mastodon. That's where I spend most of my online time. I am labyrinth.social/star-shaped there. But if you need to get me on Drupal.org or Drupal Slack, I am star-shaped there.
Nick Laughlin.
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Thanks a lot, everyone.